You're tuning into the Journey to Your Best Self podcast, where we explore the past holistic well-being, personal growth, and living a fulfilling life. Each episode, we bring you insightful conversations, practical tools, and inspiring stories to help you integrate your mind, body, and spirit on your journey to becoming your best self. Let's dive in and embark on this journey together. Welcome back to the Journey to Your Best Self podcast. As always, I'm your host, Brian O'Neill, joined by my sister, clinical hypnotherapist, certified life coach, and yoga instructor, Tara O'Neill. Here at Journey to Your Best Self, we explore the integration of mind, body, and spirit, helping you live a life full of purpose, balance, and self-discovery. Today, we're excited to welcome Dr. Tonya Cunningham, really a visionary and leader in her field, and going to bring a lot to our listeners and viewers. She has years of experience in holistic wellness and personal transformation, and she has a unique perspective on healing emotional wounds and fostering personal growth. We'll be diving into her journey, the insights she's gained, and how her work is going to help unlock people's fullest potential. Without any further ado, Dr. Tonya, welcome aboard.
Thank you for having me. So excited to be here with y'all.
Absolutely. And we're so excited to have you.
Yeah, it's going to be really helpful and informative, and also maybe not so scary, right? Grief doesn't have to be so taboo, right? So I'm really looking forward to enlightening people, or you enlightening people.
You're so right. Taboo.
Yeah, I know. I mean, on that note of the taboo, Tara and I were joking in prep earlier, and she was saying that something that she was going through her head or struggling with, and I was like, you can grieve after we talk to the grief expert, and it'll be easier for you. And I was just totally like using it in the wrong way with the wrong feel, but it was just still kind of a joke. But can you talk, maybe just to start us off, so many people have gone through some sort of grieving process or had someone close to them go through it. You know, it's kind of the cycle of life, right? We live a life and then we pass on, or someone near and dear to us passes on, and then we go through grief. But what's the biggest misconception that you've made it a mission to have people understand and try to redefine grief and coping and dealing with it?
Yeah, great question, Brian. The biggest misconception that I have come across after working in this field for years is that most people don't understand what grief really is. Kind of like what Tara started out with saying, it's been taboo. Up until about 4 years ago, in my personal and even professional opinion on what I've witnessed, the pandemic came and kind of changed our whole world, right? Of how we do things. Grief was on the forefront of that. It really brought us, even if we didn't have a person to die personally that we knew from grief, but it still impacted the whole world. So really the misunderstanding of what grief is and fearing this unknown. It doesn't have to be anything that's scary. It's painful at times, but it's not something to be afraid of.
Yeah, and even can you elaborate on the grief and the association with death, right? Because that's the first thing most people think, right? Well, yeah, well, sometimes we oversimplify these, like, oh, like sad, like something has to happen for somebody to be sad, right? Somebody has to die in order for you to feel grief or experience grief or deal with grief.
Absolutely. Grief is about separation and loss. It is not about death. Someone shared a Facebook post with me last year, and it talks about these are the things that we grieve. And at the top, it had the death of a pet, death of a loved one, and death of a relationship. But there were several other things listed underneath those three. And that post was shared over about 150 times. And what that told me is that most people don't understand what grief is. So yeah, it's about a loss of anything. So like in the pandemic, many people lost their jobs. They lost their cars, their transportation, your independence, your identity, dealing with retirement. So yeah, so grief again is something that we all experience at some point in life. We just don't recognize that we're in that space.
Yeah. So at what point in your career, in your life, were you like, oh my gosh, I have to change the paradigm. We gotta move the conversation and focus on, talking about this.
You're so right. Again, as I mentioned just a moment ago, being in this industry for 35 years, But it was only 12 years ago that I started really doing this work to change the paradigm. And it was a divorce that caused me to do it. As human beings, generally, we are creatures of habit. Who's that? Newton's law of motion. A body at rest is going to stay at rest until a greater force comes along and moves it out of the way. For me, that greater force was a divorce. Now, prior to that, I had many, many deaths. I buried my baby, my mother, my father. My mentor was brutally murdered 3 days before my wedding, and he was also my wedding coordinator. But I really focused on the spiritual aspect of that, because culturally, that's what we're taught. We're going to pray about it and we're going to move on, never dealing with the emotions. So that divorce really was the catalyst to cause my paradigm to change, and really realize, okay, you have been in grief, stuck in grief, and you did not allow yourself to properly mourn. Because grief and mourning are different. They're not the same.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to touch on the divorce, I had a similar experience, and I had a counselor, who said, well, it's similar because you'll never see that person again. And I know, not to clump it into death, but, death
Mhm.
of a relationship it is, like you said, uh, so interesting, maybe when it happens firsthand. Um, and the perspective, there's almost two, like, and I know maybe we digress a little bit, there's almost like shame that comes along with, well, why aren't you over it already, right? Move
Yeah.
on, when it comes to relationships and death, of course. But I do think that people can relate to this, because it's like, well, you got to get to the next person, just move on to the next person, and you'll, of course,
Mhm.
you're sad, you're sitting in it. So how do we change that conversation, and what steps do we take? Are there resources out there anymore, or how would you even introduce that to a client or someone that's interested? Because and also, so I guess two-parter, is there shame around it, like, people not being able to, quote unquote, get over it?
Yes, it can be shame associated with it. Again, that's going to be influenced by our culture, or just societal expectations, because we are expected. Something else that came across, I'm a former hospice worker. And as I came out of that field, the corporate world, the National Hospice Association was doing research on how we define bereavement. Because you get bereavement days, right? Normally you get maybe 3 to 5.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's yeah, unheard of. So they're looking at, maybe we need to give more days for our employees to be able to experience that. So how a person dies, or what type of death, again, if it's a death of a relationship or death of a person, you could have shame, yes, associated with it. I had shame associated with divorce as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, with relationships, and the death of a loved one, you're not just done after that 3 to 7 days of mourning, right? It might pop up in the
Right.
next relationship. It might pop up when you have children of your own, or, something else that reminds you of that person. And at that point, is it still okay to feel grief? Is it still okay to feel loss?
Yes, it absolutely is. And this also speaks to that latter part of the question that you asked. The expectation of the person in grief is to get over it. The truth is, you never get over grief, but you do adjust to it. And the reason you never get over it, you can move forward, but you move forward with your grief or in your grief, because grief is what happens on the inside. It's an emotional and it's a chemical response. And when we talk about chemicals, we're referring to hormones that release from our brain the moment you experienced your loss, whatever it was. Grief hit your brain. Yeah, so grief never ends, but the pain of it does. And how do we cause the pain to dissipate? Is through working through it. So you move forward, but you don't get over it.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the chemicals, right? So we know of, oxytocin and dopamine. When
Yeah.
we think of a loved one, we get a gooey feeling. Is
Yeah.
it the opposite? Is it stress hormones?
Yes, it is the stress hormones. We're talking about that cortisol the adrenaline, the norepinephrine. So even because sometimes people will express, I'll say, how are you doing since your mom just died? Oh, I'm good. I'm not grieving. And I'll just smile because they don't know that everybody grieves. Men, women, black, white, rich, poor, whether we have faith, no faith at all. Absolutely every human being grieves. Grieves because of that chemical, the cortisol. It just floods into the bloodstream, and which is normal though, which is normal. The problem comes when we don't allow ourselves to acknowledge the grief and to work through that. We have an overabundance of those chemicals in our bodies. And that's where the problem can come. Actually, it can cause physical sickness because grief is on the inside. If you don't get it out through mourning, mourning is how you cope. Mourning is what happens on the outside. So if you don't get your grief out, where is all that hurt and that pain staying? Staying in your body and going to your cells and can make you physically sick.
And that's on top of the stress that we already have, probably, right?
Absolutely, it is on top of the everyday experiences and stresses that we're enduring.
Yeah. And can you talk to a phenomena that I'll sometimes have clients who will and when I was practicing out in California, they'll say, well, I quit my job, I moved out here, I'm starting to be healthy, I get sunshine, I get rest, and all this grief is coming up, all this pain is coming up. And so can you speak to the phenomena of when people start to get better, some of those heavier things come in, and what to do, and how that they're not abnormal?
It certainly isn't abnormal at all. The brain is a wonderful thing to understand because memories never leave, they're recorded. Our body holds trauma, our brain holds trauma. And so we could experience some moments in our present day and it will bring up something, a memory from what happened to us previously. And something else it can do when you're moving in a better space. Sometimes when we have some losses or things we haven't addressed, they're going to come to the surface, kind of like the iceberg theory. 10% of what we see of that iceberg uh, um, above ground sea level is 10%, but there's a whole 90% that we don't see. So sometimes these emotions or things will come up and we don't even recognize that they're there until you're in the moment of it.
Yeah,
Wow,
no, it's so
that's
beautifully
amazing. Yeah. And you talk about how we're human and we have to deal with everything, and things are imprinted and they never go away. And I'm thinking about some of the challenges. It's like the saint-like task that you have to kind of absorb a lot of this and deal with it, right? So just a couple of questions about what you do to kind of be successful. I'm assuming it's from the outside looking in, right? One of the things that you do when you counsel for grief, one of the ways that you can be effective is making a connection with the people that you're working with, right? So what are some of the things that you do maybe with people that you're not that familiar with, right? It might be easier if you have a history with somebody to connect with them, but if there
Mm-hmm.
is a sudden loss, what are some of the things that you do to allow them to open up and connect with you so you can better help them through the process? Are there cues that you're reading? Are there questions that you're asking? How do you vibe with them so that they'll trust you and then allow
Mm-hmm.
you to do your job more effectively?
Yes, because the only way that any type of counseling helps us is when we are vulnerable to receive it. And most
Mm,
oftentimes, people don't like settings like that because they don't want to be vulnerable, especially in front of a stranger.
mm,
And so I listen to their story. I'm a storyteller. And so when they're telling me the story, that's when I'm picking up the cues. I'm like, okay. I was working with someone and they were there for the death of a child, but they also talked about estrangement from a parent and brought it up in the first session. I said, there's some grief there. And I said, I think we're going to have to look at that. I'm not here for that. I'm here for my parent. I'm like, okay, sure. And we moved on. And then a few months down the road, guess what came up? We did have to address, the estrangement from the parent. So I'm looking for those cues in their words, in their body language. But the main thing I really do, Brian, is try to create a safe space for them. Safe space in listening actively. I've had many people come and share, said they tried counseling before and they went to a grief counselor and said, man, I left. I've heard two responses. They said they left counseling the counselor, or they left with the counselor crying because of what they went through. And
Oh,
I
wow.
had to apologize. I said, I'm so sorry that you experienced that. But I believe, yes, we need the educational background as a grief counselor, but you also need the experience, because you can't really connect when you're teaching about grief unless you've experienced it and navigated it well.
That's awesome. And you kind of are leading me into a follow up again to figure out, how you're successful at this. And you said 3 decades or over 3 decades, 35 years, which is just a testament to, resolve and your passion for helping people out. And I definitely commend you for that. How do you, I don't know if protect is the right word, but how do you shield yourself when you have
Mm-hmm.
to hear all these stories? And even if you're
Mm-hmm.
not closely linked to them, anybody just hears about some kind of trigger or event that leads to grief of someone else, and they're going to feel some kind of way. Everyone's going to react differently. It might sit with someone longer, but you're getting the first
Mm-hmm.
hand, right? You're on the front lines and you're just getting bombarded with this month after month, year after year. What are some of the things that you do to kind of keep yourself strengthened so it just doesn't overwhelm you? You're trying to help them, but you don't want to be stuck because you have to kind of bear this burden. How do you distance yourself? Is there kind of a protective layer that you put up? Do you have some practices of how you
Mm-hmm.
can cope and then move on? Or, what are some of the things that you do for self-care?
Great. I get asked that question a lot. And to be honest, again, that is something that I am just getting to the point of learning to master, because I really didn't start working in this space that I'm in now, or the capacity that I am now, until the last 12 years with that divorce. Prior to that, again, I was surface level. I was spiritualizing everything. I wasn't dealing with the emotionality of it. But the one thing that I did do different with this time with the divorce, is that I was open with it. I was vulnerable, and I let people see my hurt and my pain. That has connected with so many people, especially people middle age. I'm a middle ager. I'm AARP, and I tease about that. And I say to my audience often, there's nothing wrong with us getting older. Um, life is not older. Life is not over because we're getting older. So I rest. My rest regimen is non-negotiable. My bed, I had to invest in a quality bed to get quality sleep. I separate myself. I do, because I'm an empath and I take on a lot of people's energy. So I have quiet time, and I've worked with my family, my friends. They know now that I'm not going to go to every family reunion. I'm not going to go. I love y'all. I'm not going to go to everybody's birthday party. I have my own therapy time, and because it was during the pandemic, 2020, when I was working 7 days a week. At the time, I was still working a full-time job as a hospice bereavement coordinator, and I had my business too. That was so unhealthy, and I had 9 deaths of my own, and that's when I started therapy again, since that divorce, which is in 2012. And I've been in therapy since, because therapy is not just for when things are going bad. It's for when things are going good, to help you balance things out, and manage where you are so that you can move better. So I take care of myself. My diet changed. I went and took a test, because I wasn't feeling well, blood test, and found out I'm allergic to gluten. I didn't even know what gluten was. I'm like, what is gluten? It's in everything that I was eating. So I've changed my diet. I feel so much better. So now I give attention to that, to my body and what I put in it and things like that. So that's how I'm able to help all these people, by really taking care of myself.
Excellent.
I love that. Thank you. Because I do think that, healers, helpers, first liners, they need to hear that over and over, and reminders and
Mhm.
reminders. So thank you for
Yeah.
really highlighting that the importance of that. You said the word spiritualize, and it made me think of, and guilty as charged, spiritual bypass, right? So there was this part where I was like, everything happens for a reason. It's fine. Love and light and all law of attraction-y. And so I'm wondering if you could talk of how maybe that's for a little while, maybe that's like an okay phase if you need to do what you gotta do. But at some point we have to go into our mind and body to process
Mm-hmm.
and move some of the energy and some of the grief. So
Mm-hmm.
can you talk to how maybe spirituality can be helpful, but isn't the like the number one answer when it comes to the grieving?
Mm-hmm. I have learned, I was taught, and that was something that I run into a lot of working with people, especially people of faith, that we have to unlearn some things that we were taught, and before we can receive the new principles that I'm teaching. So I'm all for praying. I believe in that. I believe that spirituality is a great part of who we are. However, there are two other dimensions of us being a human being. That's our physical body and our spirit and our soul. That's three parts. And so what we have to do is give attention to each part. So when I run into someone who was like me, who only addressed the spirituality, I attempt to educate them and make them aware of how they are grieving and not even recognizing it by explaining their brain and how the brain is responding and how their body is physically tired because grief causes you to be exhausted. And they're thinking, oh my God, is that what grief is? Because most people think that a grief response is sadness. Grief can show up as anger. Grief can show up in someone in humor because they can do just what you said from a spiritual standpoint, spiritually bypass. That's exactly what I was doing, avoiding all of those emotions. So I'm teaching people now that it's not either or, it's and, because I think spirituality is a great part. We do need to connect with that. So it's both spirituality and the naturalistic part that we need to give attention to.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And you made me think of another thing of grieving. The I had a wonderful teacher, Peter Cummings. He does attachment trauma work, and he talks about grieving the experiences that we never had. And so that
Hmm.
made me think of the coping mechanisms, right?
Hmm.
And I'm out in Jersey. We have a lot of sarcasm. Sometimes it's in fun, but sometimes we use these coping mechanisms that could turn into our personality, which is fine, but we don't realize that we're hiding it through the anger, through the humor, through the numbing. So can you
Hmm.
speak to the how could we grieve something we never had? That does, like, how that does, might
Hmm.
not make sense to our logical brain.
Hmm. There is a modality of theory that is taught. It's called the empty chair concept, and where you sit a chair in front of the person and have them to speak to the person that they are mourning. Let's just say if it is a person that they're mourning. But speaking to what you shared there again, it's challenging, but it is certainly doable to be able to mourn something that you never got. And I actually had a client this morning who shared how I helped her. She said it was very helpful. Whose mom just died not too long ago, but that person had to learn how to mourn the mother that they never had while she was alive, and that helped her because there was estrangement there. So recognizing awareness is very important, I think, in grief. Awareness and acknowledging that I'm in grief and that is okay. And learning that it is okay to not be okay until you get to a point you are okay.
Yeah, no, and that's such a hopeful message as well, too, because it
Hmm.
makes it like, people can move through it in their own unique way.
Yes.
How do we even begin to grieve if we don't feel emotion? And like you said, we
Hmm.
think crying, right? It's okay to
Hmm.
cry for a little while and then you're done. How else does it look? Does it look like getting more sleep? Does it look like discussion? Is everyone a little bit different? Is there somatic movement? Is it
Hmm.
time?
Hmm. Yes, somatic is very important. I always encourage people to pay attention to your body while you're going through this process. Talking about the physical response, there is a diagnosis that is very real called the broken heart syndrome. So people can, I had my eldest client, he just died this year. I started working with him when he was 89, and he gave me permission to share his story in that he's was of the Hispanic culture, and their culture is similar to mine in that closed off, don't talk. So when his wife died, he went inward because he was taught, men don't cry, and I can't express this. And he ended up being temporarily paralyzed. And he came back to group. He had missed a while. And I said, well, where you been? How you doing? He said, well, young lady, he said, I'm 89 and I don't know if I can change, but I'm certainly going to try. My doctor told me that I have to express my grief because I was dying of a broken heart. That's how a person can literally grieve themselves to death. So it can show up physically through sicknesses. It can show up again, as I mentioned, through our anger. If you're sleeping too much, excessively, that's a sign of depression. Not necessarily clinical depression, but depression that goes along with grief.
Yeah, love it. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. And you and Tara both had kind of hinted at how it's one of the things that's challenging is it's an individual case by case basis how people are going to react. But there are certainly, when you have enough case studies and you have anecdotal evidence, that you're going to see differences between, maybe men broadly stiff upper lip, I got to be there. I got to, I can't really show my emotions necessarily. And then, I think children too, right? Working in education, it's been something that's been a focus, over the past number of years, right? How children grieve too. And that can really be challenging because they're not even as much as adults struggle with their emotions. Children, like, they're just so raw because they're still working how to even have regular everyday feelings. So this can like totally
True.
hit them. That what I'm trying to get at is I guess hospice would be the closest thing to having this as a case study. Is there a way for people to prepare, or is it all reactive dealing with grief, right? Are there things that people can do to kind of prep themselves for loss that they might face or grief that they might have to deal with? Or is it just you can't really do anything until it happens and then you got to try to scramble to figure things out?
There is a preparation that you can do. However, when the death actually happens again, there's no there's some things that will currently pop up at that particular moment. But what you're referencing is what we call anticipatory grief.
Okay.
This is the type of grief that a person can experience before the physical death happens. When does that usually take place? Usually when people are sick and you see them declining right in front of you, or a person has a cognitive deficit, they're dealing with Alzheimer's, that kind of thing,
Okay.
and they change, from being the person. So you're actually already in the grief process because you're grieving and mourning the person that they were. This is not mother. This is not my child. And so you've already actively moved in this space of grief. So when they physically die, you don't have as much of a grief experience, or it's not intense. And people who don't understand that the person has already been in grief, they'll say, oh my gosh, did you see them at the funeral? They didn't have any expression at all. Well, they kind of processed some things already before they physically died. So from that aspect, you can, from a practical standpoint, in hospice, we teach that as far as doing end of life planning, talking about it with your family, what you want done towards the end of your life can also kind of help you prepare as best as you can.
Excellent. Thank you.
And can you
Mhm.
speak to how we can, after we healthfully, not in a bypass way, but after we healthily have maybe processed or understand grief better, see it as a positive on our own awakening and personal journey? I remembered when my grandmother passed, the priest had said, feeling grief is a reminder for how deeply you love that person. And that was so that comforted me so much because I was like,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I couldn't, it almost actually, it helped me facilitate and move some of that. So I would go back, I would cling back to that. So, I mean, well, I guess that's also probably important too, is having people that understand grief,
Mm-hmm.
through your process. So, being stronger and actually like allowing yourself to have a larger heart opening experience in your life. Can you speak to
Mm-hmm.
that?
Yes. Queen Elizabeth also spoke to that statement that your priest did. She said, grief is the price that we pay for love. And that is so true. So if we dare to love, we will certainly grieve to the extent or the depth that we love. So if we love a person deeply, your grief may be intense and deep in that standpoint. I believe grief is a teacher that can teach us a lot if we're open to that. It can also be transformative, whereby growth can come. The person that you're looking at today, again, I absolutely love Tonya, who she is now, who's evolved through her grief. These glasses that I get complimented on quite often is a result of my grief, my growth. It's like a positive thing that happened to me after going through the grief of divorce was it's like I became a fashionista. I love it. These long earrings. I was so conservative prior to that divorce that I colored inside the box. I wouldn't dare step out my comfort zone. But it was like a switch came on to I like vibrant colors now and I want different. And that has been such a plus for me in my growth. My confidence has grown. So I believe and I encourage people that as you work through the pain, so many people come into a place of purpose that they've never experienced before.
Yeah, absolutely. I often ask people about a book that they have read that has transformed them over their journey. It doesn't have to be related to grief, it can be. Would you have one that you would please share or recommend to our audience?
The body holds trauma. I think that's the name of that. It's a classic book in the clinical world, but that helped me understand from a holistic standpoint physically while I was going through my healing journey. I'm like, oh my God, this is what's here, and I also discovered some things that I had not addressed prior to that divorce. Like depression was there, and I didn't know what that looked like because we didn't talk about it culturally. So that is a mainstay for me that kind of helped me through the process. Dr. Caroline Leaf, I think it's called "The Brain is Messy" or "A Messy Mind" or something like that. That helped me too, because it helped me understand how the brain works, and that okay, I'm not crazy for feeling and thinking the way that I was. I was suppressing, and so
Sure.
now I'm no longer suppressed. So those were two books that have helped me, and I recommend for people to
Oh,
read.
excellent. Thank you so much. I also, I know that it's individualized, and I know that we don't want to put like, you probably don't want to put time on this, but I know a common question will be like, well, how long am I going to feel this way?
Mhm,
How long is it going
mhm,
to take? And so can you say like, how it doesn't matter, or if, okay, after 2 years of depression,
mhm,
we should take a different approach, or
mhm,
a certain time frame, and what's not quite normal, or
mhm,
I shouldn't say normal, what's not typical.
mhm. David Kessler, he's one of the leading experts also in this particular industry, and he had determined or coined like a gauge because grief never ends. So, but he has this gauge where we can assess and how we need to intervene. He calls it acute grief. That's when the death happens. Of course, I just taught you about anticipatory grief. That's before the death happens. Then you have acute grief. Then you move into what is called early grief. That's the first 2 years of the loss. Early grief. A person is in early grief. And then beyond 2 years, you're in what is called mature grief, 3 years and beyond, mature grief, because grief never ends. Now, also add, I've learned that it depends upon um, if the person has really acknowledged and started working through the grief. If they have not, then it's going to be something totally different because believe it or not, some people can live in denial for years. But on an average, we're taught that it takes up to 5 years for that person in grief to find and create their new normal. Their new normal. It takes up to, because the first year and going into the second year, the person is in shock because a healthy brain rejects death and dying. So you're trying to still wrap your mind around this fact that my loved one is not here, or I'm divorced, or I lost my job. So that's a greater part of that 5 year period that I just mentioned. So I usually, and when I say that, I had one senior lady that I was working with, and I said, it takes up to 5 years, to find, and I highlight, find your new normal and work through your grief. It may not be 5, but it can take up to that. And she said, oh my God, I'm 80 already. I'm not going to be here for 5 years. And she's still here going strong. And she said, you were right. I have found my new normal.
That's excellent.
I think that's actually very helpful to have that, because if some people, they might spend 2 decades and not even begin the process. So in
Right.
the other way around, it's like, well, you actually saved 15 years. And not to say that somebody's life is by any means stopping as they're grieving, right? They're still going
Right.
through life. They're still finding joy and living. But it might be a little more fluid if there's less of that misunderstanding or denial or avoidance.
Absolutely.
You've given so much great advice. I do have a couple more as we wind down. One thing that, and I almost feel guilty asking, like, because you're just organically giving us so much to work with. One thing that I was curious about is, what advice would you give to the people that are moving into the role of the person that's been removed? So the new partner that is in the role of a spouse that has left. So the person may not be done with their grieving process, but and you're coming in, really not involved with that previous relationship, or, no fault or blame of yours. They're still in the grieving process, or maybe a step parent that is moving into the role that a now deceased, or, a parent in absentee. What advice do you have for people that are involved, but not directly linked to the grieving parties?
Okay. I would encourage them to acknowledge how this whole experience is impacting them, because they'll have a grief response, but it's certainly going to be different than the others that you mentioned. So acknowledge, okay, how is this impacting me? And then once you do that, definitely seek support. Support is so vital to our recovery process in the grief process, because again, we have to have sufficient support. So I would encourage that person, make sure you have support to help you do this role. And
Right,
then
because it can be a
thirdly,
burden if you come into a relationship and the person still has pictures of a previous partner or spouse or something around, right?
yep,
And it's like,
yep.
can we put something up on the mantelpiece other than like your old wedding photos or something? It can be uncomfortable to like presume that, or right? That could be challenging to get into with somebody, not knowing, where they are early or mature grieving process. And you don't want to really rekindle, like, have them now direct their stress and at you. So it's like you're sharing a space in a way with someone that's not there physically. So it's challenging, right?
I would add, you're right, it is challenging. And I would add also, you'd have to ask that person, since we're talking about like moving into partnership or spousal relationships, ask that person, do you think you've processed your grief enough to be in this space? Because a lot of times they haven't. Some people move so quickly to a relationship and they haven't processed the loss. I had a person I was working with, and it was a year for that person. He met somebody else. And I said, I think you want to slow down. You're still in the first year. I don't think that would be possibly in your best interest to do that now. And after they thought about it, they continued. I said, that is okay. You can do what you desire. But the other person went to therapy as well. And the therapist recommended the same thing. I think you should pause. It's only been a year. And that person came back and said, you were right. So attempting to move too soon. So ask, do you think you've kind of processed it? I see all the pictures still up. Do you think you've kind of processed it?
That's really being honest and open, right? And not trying to hide away from confronting that, because then
Absolutely.
things could just get exacerbated and fester. And like you guys, ladies, were both saying
Hmm.
that, months and years down the road and we're still in the same place. The other
Hmm.
question that I have is, in fact, Tanya C Ministries, we had talked about, and I do appreciate your openness to, you had said, your background and culturally, you were really leaning on the spiritual side of things when you had experienced personal grief early on. And then you're kind of open to the mind body part of that trinity, the mind body spirit that we talk about a
Hmm.
lot here. But I do worry that sometimes, and it can happen on a case by case basis, people really fall from the spirituality because a reaction that you do see is, a look to the sky and why, and blaming, God,
Hmm.
Jesus, right? Well, you're supposed to be kind, loving, merciful. How could you do this to me?
Hmm.
And they fall away. They fall so far away from faith and prayer when this happens. I'm not asking you to talk about the universal plan and why, these things happen. How can we reassure people to keep, their faith, in times of grief?
Hmm. Absolutely. I first give them permission to be where they are, because I recognize that anger is just a grief response. It doesn't scare me when they say that. Now, somebody outside of the grief arena who doesn't understand that say, "Oh my gosh." My own sister actually thought that when I went through divorce, and I was married to a guy who was also my pastor, and she wanted me to start a Bible study. We had been separated for 2 weeks, and she wanted me to start Bible study in my home. I'm like, why? The ladies at the church are hurting. I'm like, oh my gosh, girl, I'm your sister. I'm hurting. No, I'm not doing the Bible study. And when are you going back to church? Because I was angry with God. When are you going back to church? Um, Probably December 31st. This was up in February. And so it was really, I was being sarcastic with her. But I give people permission to be where they are. And as they work through the anger, they'll turn back to God, and their relationship oftentimes is they're closer to God than they were before the loss. So my encouragement again is I follow them where they are. I follow their lead. If they are spiritual bypassing, I let them spiritual bypass until they get to the point to realize that that's not natural. But if again they have moved away from their faith, I follow their lead in that, and then I kind of gently guide them back to that. And I have great success with that. It has been wonderful to see people's relationship um, with God and their faith be strengthened because of this tragedy.
Mm. That's
Well
so
said.
beautiful.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Hmm.
All
Well,
right.
I
Dr.
just want to say
Tanya, yeah,
thank
we definitely both
appreciation.
want to say thank you. I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you. I want to say
Yeah,
thank you. I
yeah,
want to
no,
say
I
thank you. I
want
want
to
to say
say this
thank you.
is
I want to
really
say thank you.
something
I was like
that
unified.
we're in unison. We're all, we're all on the
I
same
love it.
page.
Yeah, I
For
mean,
those of you that are
for
only listening,
one,
not watching, we're just smiling, like
sure.
we're very much at peace. So we really appreciate you talking about things and doing the work that you do and bringing light to things that are a little bit heavier, a little bit darker. But in the end, like
Hmm.
you said, I mean, that's such a beautiful message to end on, is you can have a closer relationship with God, universe, yourself, source,
Hmm.
Jesus, whoever you might connect with in a
That's
larger
right.
picture. And to me, that's just such a powerful message that we try to keep, people, looking up, look up at the sky, look at the bright side, so to
Hmm.
speak, because there's
Hmm.
so much out there for
That's
them.
right.
And so we want to spread that hope and that joy and that beautiful energy that you have. So thank you so much.
Hmm.
And to expand on that too, you're definitely such a breath of fresh air, and I want to keep this in while we're rolling, because a lot of times we get some people that have tendency to meander. We're talking about some deep philosophical, esoteric
Yeah.
things, but I really liked how everything you say is with purpose and authority, and it really is impactful. You're really at peace with yourself, and you're really authentic
Hmm.
and real. So that comes across, and viewers and listeners
Hmm.
definitely are going to be able to feel it. So, where can they find you to get more of the impact that Dr. Tonya medicine. Where can they find you online, and what do they expect when they get there?
Absolutely. You're going to see exactly what you get here. The authenticity. I'm on social media, so follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And I provide lots of content there that can help you on your journey as well, to support you. My website is drtonyacunningham.com. I offer 15-minute consultations. So they can definitely reach out to do that, and we can connect one-on-one, and I can see if we need to do one-on-one or move you towards, we're doing group coaching now to see if you'll be a better fit there. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we hope to connect again soon.
Yes. Looking forward to it. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you both.
Okay. Thank you. Stay blessed there.
All right. Y'all too. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Journey to Your Best Self podcast. We appreciate you being part of this community. For more resources, insights, and ways to connect, head over to youroneself.com. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, including Apple, Spotify, and Overcast. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, keep aligning your mind, body, and spirit, and peace, love, and self-discovery. Thank you.